This is episode 118 of That Shakespeare Life. That Shakespeare Life is now available on our very own digital app. This app works on your tablet, phone, or TV and lets you explore the history of William Shakespeare with exclusive content, interviews, and documentaries not available anywhere else. You can cook, dance, and play your way through the life of William Shakespeare, all without any commercials. Find out more at cassidycash.com/experience and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi. I'm Susan Abernathy, historian at thefreelancehistorywriter.com. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
We have the famous advice from Hamlet to the players about suiting the action to the word and the word to the action. That seems to me to be a good way into thinking about how you need to fit words to a scenario. You fit words to a person, you fit words to an audience, and you fit words to your performance space.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In the 16th century, as Shakespeare was writing plays like All's Well That Ends Well, Hamlet, and Julius Caesar, Shakespeare turned to classical philosophers like Cicero and Isocrates to find tales exploring not only what constituted decent or proper behavior, but what happened to people when those invisible rules of decorum were altered or violated. We've long lauded Shakespeare for including the works of famous Latin and Greek poets in his stories, as well as laughed at what happens when these rules are violated on stage. But as our guest this week, Scott Newstok, is here to share, Shakespeare was doing more than simply building on the stories he found in the past. The ideas of Cicero and Isocrates concerning what it meant to fit a word to the action or an action to the word was built into the very fabric of who these early modern playwrights were, as well as an accepted cultural perspective from the 16th century that believed people, ideas, words, and even their clothing ought to fit together properly. Intriguingly, many of these playwrights came from craftsman backgrounds, with Shakespeare being born to a glover and Marlowe being born to a shoemaker as just two examples. Playwrights like Shakespeare and his contemporaries were applying to their craft on stage what they knew to be true about art in general, that the details needed to fit the scene where they were being used. This approach was not only standard industry practice in Renaissance theater, but the culture of the audience themselves would have considered taking care to make proper connections between the character actor and the outfit in performance to be what Scott Newstok calls fitting to the times. Scott Newstok is the author of How to Think Like Shakespeare, and he joins us this week to explore his chapter of that book called Of Fit, where he explores the historical and cultural context of Shakespeare's plays, including the idea that for Shakespeare, precision with words, actions, and even costumes was as much a well-established professional standard as it was creative genius. Hello, Scott. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Cassidy. It's nice to be here.
Scott's chapter called Of Fit in his latest book, How to Think Like Shakespeare, refers to Cicero's writing as an explanation for fit, explaining, quote, "Nothing is more difficult than to see what is fit in both life and words," end quote. Scott, Cicero appears as a minor character in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and one of Shakespeare's contemporaries, Ben Jonson, wrote an entire play on Cicero. Was Cicero a popular person like a celebrity might be today for the 16th century?
Yes, Cicero has a wide range of influences in the 16th century. And going back even earlier, we think of the founding of the Renaissance as partly based on Petrarch's rediscovery of Cicero's letters and Petrarch's own letters that he wrote to Cicero. So in some ways, the ongoing centuries-long conversation with Cicero is something that's generated in Italy and then continued through Erasmus and through the 16th century in English Tudor humanist educational practices. So Cicero is admired as a philosopher. He's admired as a political theorist, as a kind of person who's thinking through what it means to have a republic, what civil wars entail. And then I think that thing that has the most direct influence on Shakespeare is Cicero's status as an orator, as someone who thought deeply about the power of speech and the necessity for the liberal arts to create a person who is adept at thinking through complex issues and speaking well about them. So the kind of overarching sense of something that unifies, I think, a lot of those strands of thought in Cicero is his sense of decorum, or another word that we would have for that would be fit. The sense of doing the right thing at the right time, or being connected to the kinds of potentials for action in a particular circumstance. Fit is a very abstract notion, but I think we all can recognize when something has a good fit and when something has not quite so good a fit, whether that's in clothing or whether that's bad fit for a politician in a political seat, or architecture or a play, all kinds of different things we talk about in terms of having good fit or bad fit. And Cicero really is a magnificent thinker on what fit entails.
Several of these philosophers whose works came over from Italy weren't originally written in English. And one translator from Shakespeare's life, which helped bring the words of famous ancient philosophers to the English audience, was John Barry, who translated Isocrates just before Shakespeare's life in 1557. And when it did publish, it came out in tandem with another translator, Benedict Berg's version of Distichs of Cato. Cato was often turned into English theater well into the 18th century. Now, Scott, was it an industry-wide practice for Renaissance playwrights like William Shakespeare to turn to Greek and Roman stories as sources for theater?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, in part that emerges out of their grammar school training, where they were reading Latin sources, Latin translations of Greek sources, and then later on, often Greek sources as well, whether that was, again, letters, essays, political philosophy, drama. Those were an immense archive, an immense kind of trove of ideas and plots and characters and ways of thinking. Again, I think what ends up being less the direct influence, but a more powerful influence, is the influence of figures like Cato and his distichs as pedagogical influences. So those distichs are one of the longest standing Latin and then eventually translated into vernacular language textbooks for small children beginning their educational career. So they're dense, they're little 2-line units, they're giving you opportunities to think through basics of grammar, but they're also pushing a little kind of moral point or sententious point. And you can see, I think, some of that, traces of that influence in Shakespeare's couplets at the close of a scene, or when you have a sententious character like Polonius, who ends up sounding a lot like the distichs of Cato, or sounding a lot like some of the sayings of Isocrates, that in some ways Shakespeare's staging a kind of pedagogy, maybe a tired pedagogy, or a cataloging of truisms through the voice of a character like Polonius.
Scott's chapter on fit states that, quote, Shakespeare and his contemporaries emerged from the culture of handicraft trades, often concerned with fashion and clothing, end quote. Scott, what were some of the handicraft backgrounds of Shakespeare, and which contemporaries are you referencing specifically?
So one of the governing conceits of the book is thinking as a kind of a craft, less of a science and more of an elaborated art that we achieve with other people who know things and who share things with us and help us practice that craft. I think that's accurate to my sense of what education is all about. And I think it's also accurate to what 16th century education was like. So it turns out, it shouldn't be surprising, but in some ways it is really striking that many of Shakespeare's peers grew up in artisanal households. In part, that's a credit to the enormous social mobility that the Tudor educational system generated, that people from the middle ranks, boys, of course, this is a gendered educational structure, were able to achieve mobility through the in-depth training that they had in speaking and writing and rhetoric. And so someone who is like George Peele, someone who's the son of a salter, could end up becoming a playwright, like Anthony Munday, the son of a draper, John Webster, the son of a merchant tailor, Robert Herrick, the son of a goldsmith. It goes on and on and on. Almost everyone has, if you're not from the aristocracy, you tend to be emerging out of these artisanal households. Shakespeare coming from a glover's household, Marlowe coming from a shoemaker's household. One thing that's fascinating to try to think through is what kinds of things would you learn in such a household, even if they're not directly related to what looks like on the surface would be the things that would train you for theater. Among the many things I think you can learn from such a household is thinking about using things efficiently, thinking about processes of making, thinking about suiting your product to an audience and a changing market. I think those are all things that can be habituated or can be observed through a craft household or through an artisanal household. And Shakespeare's just one of many writers who emerges from such a household.
In Merry Wives of Windsor, Shakespeare uses the phrase, quote, "Does he not wear a great round beard like a glover's paring knife?" End quote. Scott, what was the actual glove-making process in the 16th century that lends this line the meaning it needs?
So the glove-making process obviously has to start with the obtaining of the skins, or before that, even the slaughter of the animals, the transport of those skins into your household yard, and then the stretching of those skins to allow the scraping away that the Merry Wives of Windsor quotation alludes to, scraping away of the non-skin parts that you don't want when you're working this product into leather. So that includes hair, that includes blood, that includes fat, and you're scraping with this large round paring. It's called a paring knife, but it looks like a much more the size of a plate. You can see this object on display in the household in Stratford-upon-Avon. So you stretch it, you're scraping it, you're dyeing it, you're drying it, you're tanning it, you're cutting it, you're stitching it, you're embellishing it. It's an elaborated process that's intimately connected to the object and the material as you're shaping it over time. And you're also intimately connected with the almost chemical process of transforming that material. So some of that process entails urine and feces that you need to have in order to make the transformations of changing that animal's hide into a very supple leather that then you could use for luxury goods, such as a kind of a glove that you would sell in your shop.
Scott's book talks in detail about how being able to recognize whether a particular element of fashion or even just a manner of speech was fitting to a particular situation is very important for 16th century culture. Scott, this suggests a great deal of precision got put into Shakespeare's plays, both with his nonverbals as well as specific word choices for his plays. Where can we see examples of Shakespeare being intentional with his characters about what is supposed to fit in a particular scene for 16th century standards?
We have the famous advice from Hamlet to the players about suiting the action to the word and the word to the action. That seems to me to be a good way into thinking about how you need to fit words to a scenario. You fit words to a person, you fit words to an audience, and you fit words to your performance space. So there's been a ton of great work in the last couple of decades thinking hard about that dynamic relationship of text to performance and text to the reception of the audience and the co-presence of actors on stage with a visible audience in the theater, in whatever venue they happen to be performing. One of the things that is unique about Shakespeare's status as a playwright, as we know, is that since he was a shareholder in his own company, he had an ongoing relationship to the members of his company. He had it's more of a repertory company than we would think of some of the other relationships of playwrights where they were being paid for individual plays rather than having a long-standing, ongoing relationship with a group of people. So there are many examples of thinking through or recognizing the fact that Shakespeare's writing parts with certain players in mind. That we know, for example, that John Sinclair was tall and thin, and the characters that Shakespeare wrote for him were made fun of the tallness and thinness of that particular role, like Dr. Pinch in Comedy of Errors or the tailor in Taming of the Shrew. We also have a fascinating, there's fascinating evidence about this relationship between actor and role when in some of the plays we have, instead of the character speech prefix, we end up having an actor named in the speech prefixes. So most notably, Will Kemp shows up a number of times when it should say something like Peter for Romeo and Juliet. It says, "Enter Will Kemp." Or in Much Ado About Nothing, Will Kemp is named as well as Cowley for their roles. And you have the sense of there's a kind of intimate way in which that particular part was written for that person and their particular talents. And Kemp, of course, is also famous because he was known for dancing well and doing his jigs. And when he leaves the company, and Armin comes in. We have that shift to Armin's better at singing, and some of the clowns post 1599, 1600 are written more with Armin in mind. So that there's a wonderful way in which Shakespeare is able to tailor the cast. He's able to tailor the roles for the particular actors that he has. And I think you can expand that sense of fit and suiting the word to the action in all kinds of other fascinating ways, whether you're thinking about indoor performance versus outdoor performance, whether you're thinking about a revival of a play and repertory. There's even examples of a reciprocal relationship of print influencing the shape of the words on the page. So there's a great instance of the 1602 quarto of Merry Wives of Windsor, which had been mostly in prose, gets transferred into verse, kind of forced into verse, in part, we presume, this is Doug Brewster's presumption, because the market for all prose plays was tanking and people wanted to buy plays with verse in them. So you take a play that's predominantly prose and you force it into verse in order to fit the market, in order to suit the demands of the market. So like any creator, I think any artist has to find fascinating ways to connect what they do with demand. Both they're creating demand and they're also trying to fulfill demand and suit their creations to what people will pay for.
Scott quotes David Byrne for an example for did I say that wrong? You laughed.
Oh, that's right. That's right. Okay. Oh. I love that passage, though. I'm just laughing because I was just watching some old Talking Heads videos last night and thinking about fit and him wearing that giant suit in the Stop Making Sense video. It looks like Macbeth being dressed in borrowed robes, where this enormous suit looks like it does not fit the human being that's in it, and that's done deliberately. So it's funny that Byrne's the guy who's talking about artistic fit. That's why I was chuckling.
Okay. I read these things, but they don't come with phonetic pronunciation, so I'm always scared the first time I say it.
No, you're right.
All right, excellent. Scott quotes David Byrne for an example for the 16th century cultural application of fitting your words, deeds, and outfits to the time in which they are occurring. Scott quotes David as saying, "Genius, the emergence of a truly remarkable and memorable work, seems to appear when a thing is perfectly suited to its context." Scott, here on That Shakespeare Life, we have a long-standing contention that Shakespeare's plays act like time capsules in their ability to show us what it was like in England culturally when those plays were first performed. Does your research into the idea of fitting and the overall expectations of what made good theater in 16th century England seem to support that idea? Can we see into the past through Shakespeare's plays, and was that done intentionally by Shakespeare?
That's interesting. I think it is true that we are able to see what kinds of things were expected and what kinds of things were valued when we think our way back into the forces that influence the production of any cultural object. I do think that Shakespeare is somewhat anomalous, somewhat unusual in early modern theater for both being able to create works that fit or suited the moment and have those works also endure in less time-bound ways than some of his contemporaries' works seem to be. If you think about the long arc of Shakespearean reception, by the time you get to 18th and 19th century productions of the plays, part of what seems to become apparent in later centuries is that those plays are productively malleable and able to be stretched and fit new environments or fit new circumstances in a way that is not always the case with some of his contemporaries, which, again, on occasion feel more time-bound or place-bound, or the jokes fall flat because they're citing contemporary political events or contemporary characters. So in some ways, it seems like Shakespeare was fortunate, or he wasn't anticipating this, but in terms of the long history of the reception of his work, it has been a fortunate byproduct of that ability to be, I guess, stretchable or malleable or being able to fit different kinds of circumstances. So it's absolutely the case that they were made for that moment and oftentimes refashioned through the repertory over multiple years or refashioned for print over the lifetime of the playwright, as well as his posthumous print reputation. But I do think that there's something, it's not odd, but there's something powerful about the way in which those plays can be reformed and resuited to new circumstances across the globe and across time in a way that's just not the same for Thomas Dekker or Christopher Marlowe.
Cheverel comes up consistently in this chapter as a kind of metaphor based in the 16th century practice of glove making. Scott, explain the history of cheverel here when Shakespeare uses it in All's Well That Ends Well, Taming of the Shrew, Hamlet, and Twelfth Night. Let's define what cheverel is, first of all, and then what is the real life context for cheverel that's being applied here by Shakespeare in these lines?
So cheverel is a specific kind of leather that's made from kid goats. So when we're talking about treating someone gently with kid gloves, you're speaking about the kind of most delicate and most supple, most pliable, most flexible type of leather that you have, as opposed to dog leather, which is actually used for cheaper gloves in the era. So if you want the highest quality type of leather, then you're looking for cheverel leather, and that will make the gloves that will command the highest price in the market and be most valued by the market as well. So the cheverel ends up becoming proverbial. It's not just in Shakespeare alone. Jonson uses it. Other figures use it. Dramatists use it. Non-dramatists deploy it as a conceit for a kind of pliability or admirable flexibility. So Festes the clown talks about a sentence being but a cheverel glove to a good wit, how quickly the wrong side may be turned outward. Mercutio talks about a wit of cheverel conscience comes up in Henry VIII. So it's an easily recognizable shorthand, so to speak, for something that's flexible, something that's able to be a valuable luxury good and to be valued in part for its flexibility. And of course, on top of that, gloves then end up becoming a kind of proxy for love or for erotic attachments. I'm leaving you my glove as a symbol of my love for you, or also for social antagonism. I'm throwing my glove down as a challenge to you. So gloves have a long and fascinating, symbolic logic in terms of what cultural associations we have with leaving someone a glove or throwing a glove at someone, whether that's a high quality glove or a low quality glove.
Scott's book surprised me when he suggests on page 45 that, quote, already in Shakespeare's lifetime, verses were attributed to him that we know weren't written by him, end quote. Scott, what were these verses and how do we know that Shakespeare didn't write them and also that he was being misattributed in his own lifetime?
So we have, for instance, in 1599, we have the publication of The Passionate Pilgrim, which is attributed to Shakespeare and has sonnets that eventually work their way into the 1609 quarto of sonnets, but it also has a number of poems that we know are not by Shakespeare. And in fact, in 1612, in a later reissue of The Passionate Pilgrim, an expanded reissue, we have a record of Shakespeare's name eventually being withdrawn by Jaggard, the publisher, in part, we think, because of complaints by Shakespeare for having poems attributed to him that were not by him. We also have plays that are attributed to him in the first decade of the 17th century. So The London Prodigal in 1605 has Shakespeare's name on the title page. The Yorkshire Tragedy in 1608 likewise does. And then this is somewhat more debatable, but there are examples of plays and poems that have WS on the title page that there's speculation that maybe a printer was attempting to capitalize on the familiarity with Shakespeare's name or the kind of brand name of Shakespeare with those attributions. That's more arguable, that's more contentious. But with The Passionate Pilgrim and with Yorkshire Tragedy and London Prodigal, you do have the sense that Shakespeare's become a kind of a brand as someone that will help sell titles. And of course, we know that even already from his own works published in the 1590s, that he undergoes that transition from plays published anonymously to his name eventually appearing on the title page, whether that's, for instance, Richard II between the 1597 quarto and the 1598 quarto. We go from an anonymous Richard II to a Richard II that's attributed to Shakespeare. So that emerging sense of Shakespeare as a marketable name is developing through the 1590s into the early 1600s.
This is fascinating history into the idea of what's fitting, and I know we would love to explore this further. Scott, what are some of your favorite books or resources that you can recommend we use to learn more?
So I have a section at the end of the book that is called Kinsmen of the Shelf, which is a great line from Emily Dickinson, which I just adore. It has that sense of you being family or being in conversation with other writers, which I think all writers do and do appreciate. So, there's a great little book by an architectural historian named Robert Geddes that's called Fit, an Architect's Manifesto. It's only about 40 pages long, but it really captures the complexity of fit in the history of architecture. There's a great little book, a recent book on gloves and glove making by Mike Redwood. There's a number of books on the history of rhetoric that give due prominence to Cicero and the debates about whether you should imitate Cicero's style or whether you should not imitate Cicero's style. So Heinrich Plett and Peter Mack and all kinds of people have written fascinating accounts for what humanist pedagogy was like and what the consequences, what the effects of that pedagogy were on writing in the 16th century. In particular, if you look at English education in the 16th century, Lynn Enterline has written a brilliant book called Shakespeare's Schoolroom, where she's able to trace direct paths from the kinds of practices of imitation that he would have been practiced in the classroom to the kinds of things that he did on stage. Jeff Dolvin does the same in his book Scenes of Instruction. There's great work on classical influence on Shakespeare by Colin Burrow and Jonathan Bate. And there's all kinds of work on the leather trade and thinking through what gloves meant in 16th century Europe by Peter Stallybrass and Anne Rosalind Jones, as well as by Anston Bosman. I'm happy to share those passages with you.
Scott's book does list several of these resources, and his footnotes in his book are fantastic. When I was reading through this, it was great to jump down there and be able to see exactly where these just nuggets of historical gold were coming from. And I encourage you to check those out for even more Shakespeare history. We'll link to Scott's book as well as the resources he recommends today and those passages that you so generously agreed to share with us in the show notes for today's episode. You'll find those at cassidycash.com/episode 118. Scott, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, I think I would want something that was capacious and that would capture my imagination and my attention for a long period of time. I think we've all been struggling to find that thing to read these last few months as we've been in various forms of isolation and quarantine. I think for me, if I had to choose a one volume, it probably would be Milton's Paradise Lost, as one 17th century commentator praised it as the story of all things. I think it's a marvelously, endlessly rewarding poem that captures my thought and spurs me to new insight every time I look at it and every time I pick it up. So that's probably the volume that I would choose to supplement those other two.
You would be well set up on your deserted island for sure with this collection. So what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I just finished an essay on the 19th century African-American actor Ira Aldridge for my friend Ayanna Thompson, with whom I've collaborated over decades. And Aldridge is just a fascinating character. He ends up getting a start in New York City, not really being able to advance professionally, and then becoming one of the first self-sustaining professional actors in Europe throughout the mid-19th century. So that was a fascinating essay to explore, and I'm pondering whether I have more to say about Aldridge or not. I've also done a lot of work on Orson Welles and the racial dynamics of his Shakespearean adaptations, as well as a production of Marlowe's Dr. Faustus, which he did in the 1930s for the WPA Theater, which has not been written on as much as his Shakespearean adaptations have been explored. So I'm thinking about digging my way back into Orson Welles again.
Oh, and watching Chimes at Midnight, I hope.
Yes, one of my favorite films of all time. Absolutely. A brilliant, I think a Shakespearean version of Shakespeare, of synthesizing multiple sources, just like Shakespeare synthesized multiple sources. Wells quotes from Holinshed. He's going back to Shakespeare's own sources when he's adapting Shakespeare. So there's something that's wonderfully sponge-like and agglomerative about Wells's own creative process.
Well, Scott Newstok, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing with us about how to think like Shakespeare. I know we look forward to seeing your future publications and appreciate you being here today.
Thank you, Cassidy. It was great fun.
All of the resources Scott mentions in today's episode, as well as pictures and archival images of people like John Sinclair, Will Kemp, and Robert Armand that Scott mentions today, can be found along with information on Scott and his new book, How to Think Like Shakespeare, in the show notes for today's episode. Find all of that and more history at CassidyCash.com/episode 118. That's CassidyCash.com/EP118. How would you like to see the video of this week's interview? You can watch this interview as well as other exclusive interviews not available anywhere else right inside That Shakespeare Life app. That's right! That Shakespeare Life is now streaming on our very own digital app. We are very excited to make this available, and not only can you stream podcast episodes anywhere you go, but the app contains exclusive content like activities, games, documentary shorts, expert interviews, and animated plays, all free from ads and available anywhere you might be. You can learn Shakespeare's history from the experts who know him best while you're in the carpool line, cooking dinner, or even while you're working out. Take Shakespeare history with you wherever you go, all without any commercials. Download the app now at CassidyCash.com/experience. That's CassidyCash.com/experience. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.